Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. Okay, and hopefully you all can see my presentation at this point.
Yes, we can.
Thanks so much. So I wanted to say, before I even start talking about imagery and looking at riparian areas from the sky, I want to emphasize that there is nothing like walking through a riparian area, especially after a planting event when you can see what's happening and how the place has been transformed. And so really what I like to think about these types of options with remote sensing as a way to tell the story of a place to those who can't be there, or for the purposes of reporting or securing future funding, or to learn about what's working and what's not, potentially for planning. So I really see this as something that's complementary to everything that we do in the field, all the ground-based monitoring, measuring that happens. There's nothing like walking through and seeing which plants survived, which ones are doing well and which haven't. And let's think now about some ways that we can help tell these stories with low cost or freely available sources of information. So what I'll do today is walk through some of the information you would need to maybe think about some of the places where you work or the reporting that you need to do, and what some of the options are out there in the specific context of riparian areas, in this case in Eastern Washington. So one of the things we'll talk about is just how to go about choosing from available imagery to fit riparian monitoring needs or gaps. We'll go through some of the things that we found we could do with access to free images and cloud computing platforms. I'll explain what that means. Talk a little bit about when drones might be useful for riparian monitoring, and the more I think about it, I found it incredibly useful for promotional purposes and communication, storytelling, and potentially planning and design as well. And then something about what's involved in implementing these types of approaches to monitoring. And all of this comes out of some work I did while I was a student, a graduate student here at WSU in partnership with the Palouse Conservation District. So I'm reporting on our experiences from an exploratory study, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Feel free to post them and we can get to them during or after the presentation. So I'll start out with an example of NAPE imagery. This is the National Agricultural Imaging Program, and there are aerial photos available for agricultural areas across the country, actually, with 1 meter resolution. And so this is an example of what it looks like for a riparian area in Eastern Washington. So a lot of times, this type of imagery is the first thing that comes to mind when people are thinking about riparian monitoring. Because it's well known, it's widely available, it's actually really easy to access in the Google Earth Engine, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And it can be a great way to get a picture from the sky where the resolution is good enough that we can actually see a riparian area and potentially see and measure change over time. In this example, you'll notice these are not true color or normal photographs. For those who have not seen this before or not seen it recently, these are color infrared images. And this means that we're using the near infrared band and the red band from the imagery to detect when plants are actively photosynthesizing. So whatever you see as bright red in these images, this is active green vegetation. And the stuff that's green or brown is either brown vegetation or not vegetated. So I'll come back to color infrared images a lot throughout this presentation because I find that the riparian areas really pop and it makes it really easy to see what we're looking at. So in this example, oops, sorry, I'm missing, there's a circle here. It's actually not a circle, it's an oval. And this is the image from 2017 that was collected by this program. And in this area, we know that there was a major management change just after the year 2000. And so we had a nice imagery, but it's only collected when it was collected by the program. So that means each place on the landscape is only flown over once every few years, usually just once during the growing season, and it could be at a different time in different years, which is why the areas outside, the red vegetated areas here along the stream, hopefully you can see my mouse pointer, the areas outside that area are differently green and brown, and that's representing different amounts of moisture availability at that point in the growing season, whenever it was in that year. And so these are great snapshots in time, but we don't have any control over how often the images were collected or exactly when they were collected. And so we might end up missing what it is that we want to capture to tell our story. So what we'll do next is take a look, zooming way out. This is the satellite imagery that most folks think of first when you talk about freely available satellite imagery. This is from the Landsat program. In the white ovals here in these pictures, these are true color images circling the same area we were looking at in the previous slide. You'll notice it looks pretty blurry, and that's because these pixels are 30 meters as compared to the 1 meter resolution on the previous slide, and most of our riparian areas in this part of the world are narrower than 30 meters. So it becomes a very blurry picture and really hard to capture change that we know happened on the ground in this area, even though we know there was a major change between 1999, as in this picture, and 2019 in this picture. It's pretty hard to see anything inside there. I should mention that with satellite images, because the same path is flown at a certain return rate, a certain amount of time in between, we can collapse some of those pictures to be averages. And then we'll talk about the pixels. So each one of the squares in these images is going to have an average value from whatever times we put together. And so this is from late in the summer season. This is a composite of late July and August in each one of these years. So we can look at the color infrared version of this. So as I was saying before, the bright red areas are active, healthy vegetation, in this case at the end of the growing season when riparian areas really do stand out in eastern Washington. And here you can actually see, even with 30-meter resolution, that there is more bright red here along the stream in 2019 than there was in 1999. So really major dramatic changes on the ground might show up with this kind of imagery, but only really dramatic changes. And to introduce those who aren't familiar with it, this is another way that we measure active vegetation. It's called the NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And this is taking the same information as in this color infrared image and collapsing it down to one band so we can look at it in grayscale. And here the bright white areas are the active vegetation. And you can see again, there's just a faint signal here to show there were some major differences in all that time. Another thing to point out with satellite imagery is if there are clouds in the way when the satellite happens to fly over, it messes up your image. And so that's what some of these weird kind of whitish patches are in the 2019 true color image in the bottom left. So the question we asked with this research study was, with the new technology available using drones and cloud computing platforms, which I'll explain in a minute, how can image analysis add to the riparian monitoring toolbox and help us tell the stories of these places? So to briefly summarize the types of imagery we might think about when we're thinking about low cost or freely available imagery, on top of the examples I just showed, the NAPE imagery with 1 meter resolution, the Landsat satellite imagery with 30 meter resolution. Well, now since 2016, we have freely available Sentinel satellite imagery with 10 meter resolution for visible. So a third of the size of those blurry boxes of Landsat. So it gets a little bit closer to the size of our riparian areas. And critically, the time interval for return is 5 days, which means that we have a lot more data to work with, and we can make those average images that compensate for cloud cover much more easily and start tracking change through the growing season. And then also with drones, we can get less than 1 meter resolution, much less than 1 meter, so really fine scale, really pretty great pictures, and we can collect those in theory on demand when it's important on a site-by-site basis. And so I want to give you an example of what this looks like. I hope it's not overwhelming, but this is the Google Earth Engine cloud computing platform. And Google Earth Engine has a huge data repository. It's a petabyte scale data repository. So it has all the freely available satellite and NAPE aerial imagery and lots of other data sets built into it. And so what we can do if we learn how to write the code is we can pull out the information we want from those data sets without having to find them, download them, stitch them together, process them. Processes that formerly would take maybe days to a week, we can do in about 10 minutes. And so it takes a bunch of expertise to learn how to write these codes, but once we've written them, we can share them. And so this center panel in here shows a bunch of code. That's the code that I wrote to pull out different types of map information. But then here on the left is a place where I could start sharing those with other people, training them how to use them and helping them to troubleshoot as they run these scripts. And so the idea is suddenly it gives us streamlined access to all the big data that's being collected globally every week anyway. It's already out there and there's no charge to access it. We can process it remotely on the cloud, so I can do this just with my regular laptop, and everything is run on the cloud. So I would just send a command in my browser, come back later, and get the images or the data that I'm looking for. And so there's really a huge amount of potential with this tool. In this example, you're seeing Sentinel data, so that was the 10-meter resolution, and you can just about make out this narrow riparian area in true color here. So we still have fuzzy squares, but they're smaller fuzzy squares than Landsat, which offers a lot more to us for the riparian areas in our part of the world. So in this part of our research, we asked the question, how can we use this GEE, it's Google Earth Engine cloud computing capability, to bring this available big data down to the ground and say, is there anything that this can help us with in terms of the gaps in our ability to monitor or tell the story of our riparian areas? And so we try to unpack some of the steps that we might follow as researchers to work with folks who need to do monitoring and reporting and what that might look like. So the first step is to figure out, okay, scientifically and with available imagery, what questions can we even ask that we might be able to answer? Next is for us as researchers or folks with expertise to design a workflow that we might use, evaluate how accurate it is, and be really transparent about the sources of uncertainty. And then we work with our collaborators, in this case the Blues Conservation District staff primarily, to figure out how this could be applicable for reporting or adaptive management. And then we can think about how might we actually integrate this into existing monitoring programs in a feasible way to really enhance our toolbox. So in this particular case, we worked with a voluntary stewardship program in Washington because it provided a nice case study in that it requires watershed scale reporting of ecosystem conditions, but based on what's happening on an individual site basis within the county. So we looked at detecting land cover change at the watershed scale, which helps to maintain privacy of individuals, and focusing on figuring out, okay, what's the difference between natural variability because moisture availability changes naturally from year to year? How does that look different from the impacts of management decisions or different practices or major restoration actions from the sky? And then how can we systematically minimize the area that requires further investigation? So from the perspective of saying, where do we need to figure out what's happening on the ground, we can narrow down the places that need to be visited or further investigated. And then keeping in mind throughout, how might we develop this in a way that we can then transfer it over, for example, to conservation district staff to be able to use this. We focused on the area of Whitman and Garfield counties and the overlapping watersheds in that area. So here on this slide, you can see our study area. It extends from Spokane in the north down to Enterprise, Oregon in the south. And over this entire area, we have that 10-meter resolution. And this image is showing the NDVI that I mentioned before, and the important thing to remember is the bright white areas are active vegetation. So this is showing a composite, which is an average image from mid-August through September of 2018 in this case. And you can see if you look closely along the streams, there's the bright white where there's riparian vegetation, nice and green at the end of the growing season. So in Google Earth Engine, we were able to train the computer to automatically recognize areas that were active green at this time of year, which we called evergreen, or senescence, which means they're brown, or in here you can't really tell the areas that are not vegetated at all. This produces maps in less than 10 minutes for this entire area. You can zoom in and see it at finer scale as well, which I'll show you in a minute, and can be quickly updated to run for different time frames or in other areas, as long as they're similar enough to this area that we don't need to retrain that model. And so then once we built that, we were able to run it over images collected in different years over the same time frame. For Sentinel data, so far it only goes back to 2016. Now we have 2020 data available also, but this shows the more zoomed in view of what it looks like. So here the computer, the remote cloud computing power is recognizing areas that are green throughout the growing season. So then we asked, okay, can we look by these little 10-meter squares and say which ones were always green at the end of the growing season, which ones were always brown at the end of the growing season, and which ones changed back and forth. That's in pink here, and that's what we're kind of interested in at this point. So when we map that out, we can highlight here both changes in the extent of area that is always green over time by comparing to this as a baseline. But we can also see which areas are changing over the years in terms of whether they're green or not at the end of the growing season. And so this could be due to either natural variability in the amount of moisture at that time of year, which is a cumulative effect of all the precipitation throughout the year. And then different management practices in square parcels or circles will really stand out. For example, an irrigated area, if it has different irrigation from one year to the next, you'll be able to see that. And so that really narrows down the areas that we want to look at from a watershed or county level perspective, where we see, okay, let's figure out which areas are due to natural variability and which areas are due to a change in practices. And so in this case, we want to really unpack what the accuracy is and what the sources of uncertainty might be, and just recall that we wouldn't really want to choose these fuzzy Landsat pixels here with 30-meter resolution to look at the Palouse River, which you can barely even see in this square. So we need to be really rigorous about what data we choose to use, what images we fit to tell a certain story, the technical decisions we make in crafting the workflow, what the accuracy of the models we make is. And we found that our models had more than 90% accuracy based on the evaluation we did in the computer code. So that's not with respect to ground truthing, which is still a work in process. And then interpreting remote sense imagery, that does take some expertise, so it's always important to be aware of that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the applicability to management and challenges and opportunities for implementing this, but I want to hold that thought and move on to drone imagery and then come back to this because really there are a lot of overlapping challenges and opportunities for drone and satellite imagery. So shifting gears here for a minute, the other available technology that we looked at was drone-based imagery for riparian monitoring. In these images, you see the WSU Hudson Reserve near Smoot Hill, and these are some digitally georeferenced orthomosaics. So it's hundreds of pictures from a drone that were put together so that we could measure change through time with them. And so I'll go through what some of the riparian applications of drone-based imagery might be, are what we were able to find in our first study, what steps are involved in collecting and processing the data to just give you a sense of what the investment is there, and some of the practical considerations and limitations of these methods. So first, how does drone-based imagery fit in with these other image sources? Well, returning to this chart from the beginning, recall the NAPE imagery was 1 meter resolution, but it's only available during the growing season every 3 to 5 years for any given place. So with drones, with much finer resolution, and in theory, we can collect imagery on demand at a site-by-site basis. So drones offer potentially high-resolution imagery over small areas with the flexibility to collect data on demand. So, I mean, of course, we could fly a drone and take a video, do before and after images of a project, but specifically here, what I'm talking about is actually stitching images together, still images together, so they work like satellite images or NAPE aerial images, and we can measure them. So we tested out 2 drone-based image collection methods at about 9 different riparian sites across Whitman County with different riparian characteristics. Here on the left is an example, and this is with a consumer-grade drone setup. So here we have a true color, it's called red, green, blue, or RGB camera mounted on the drone. It's actually a GoPro, and we were able to set up autonomous missions so that the drone would fly a pre-programmed mission to collect images at the right altitude with the right amount of overlap and with geo-referenced locations on the ground, we'll explain in a minute, to create a 3-dimensional model of the surface. And I'll show you what those look like when they come out. I'd like to point out here that you see a red and blue X on the ground, so that's a control point. Those are actually pool noodles, but to do this method, we were able to use a consumer grade drone, which is relatively easy to access and low budget, maybe $1,000 or $1,500 for the setup. But we needed to have high resolution GPS to be able to get the high enough accuracy in our GPS points and be able to measure changes over time. So we have not gotten to do this because of COVID related delays, but in theory, we could go back to the same site and fly the same mission and measure at less than a meter resolution what the differences in heights or locations are of the vegetation that we image. So potentially very powerful, but the first visit to any given site, you would need to invest in this high resolution GPS survey. And this other setup that we use, this is a commercial grade drone. This has a sensor on it that can collect not just the red, green, and blue bands of a true color camera, but also near infrared and red edge, which enables us to do some of those vegetation indices and color infrared images like I showed for the NAPE and satellite imagery. And so this enables us to get at what taxa are present for the plants and then what their greenness is at different times of the year. And so you do need a special sensor to do this. The one we use is a DJI Matrice quadcopter with a MicaSense red edge sensor. This is something that's commonly used in commercial applications. And this we can use to stitch together and make these orthomosaics of imagery where we get to look at the vegetation conditions. So to summarize in words what the general workflow is to do this drone image collecting and processing, the first thing is we need to secure permission to visit a site. And so we did a lot of our workflow development at the WSU Research property and then connected with the Palouse Conservation District, and some landowners volunteered to be part of the study. So we were able to visit their properties and basically they allowed us to fly missions there and record data. So I'll share some of those anonymously in this presentation. So ahead of time, we need to visit the site, we need to figure out how we can fly it safely, we need to plan missions and mission planning software, which means we need to figure out the appropriate altitude and overlap and camera angles and all this type of detailed information we need to get a really good collection of photos, so then our software will be able to stitch them together properly. Then we need to have an app that we can use to fly the mission. So most drones come with a free app that will allow you to fly them manually, but oftentimes those manual apps will not work to fly these autonomous missions that are pre-programmed. So there's some background work there in figuring out whatever your drone setup is, what is all the different software you need to be able to plan and fly these missions. Once we've gone through all that, we can go out in the field and we can collect our images at the right altitude with enough overlap and the right angle of the gimbal, which is what holds the camera, to get what we need for the software. Then, as I said, if we want to be able to measure actual differences in height or location over time, we need to collect that high resolution GPS data with ground control points the first time at a site. And then we use this software called Agisoft Metashape. There are other softwares out there that do this. And that software will actually position all the images to build a three-dimensional model and stitch the images together. I'll show you a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then it outputs geotips, which are files that we can use in other GIS software for people that are familiar with that and like to use that. I mentioned geotips. So we get a digital elevation model. That's what DEM is. That's the three-dimensional surface with height information on it. And then the orthomosaic is the visual picture. And then from those, we can identify taxa, quantify that greenness measure, and quantify the heights of plants and something about the habitat structure from that three-dimensional model. So getting under the hood just a little bit, this Agisoft Metashape software takes a lot of images like the one in the upper right here. So this example would be one of these blue rectangles in the model down below. So essentially, the software takes all of the GPS information from the drone, how it was positioned when it took the image, and then it takes the image and it puts them all back together and it builds a dense point cloud of this whole surface. And then from that, it can figure out how it needs to stitch together all the pictures that we took to make one big mosaic. So here's one example from the WSU research property where you can see in the upper left, there's a willow tree or a couple of willow trees outlined here. You can see the edges of the stream channel. You can unfortunately see a lot of reed canary grass. But here it gives you a little sample of what the three-dimensional surface looks like in the gray here. And you can see it's pretty lumpy, so it's not, the accuracy in the vertical dimension is not as good as in the horizontal dimension, and some of them come out better than others. But you can see the uneven surface of the reed canary grass in this case. And then we can do things like drape the true color image over the three-dimensional model and move it around and look at it. And these are all georeferenced, so we can measure changes over time if we're able to go back and fly the same mission again. I should say the missions themselves are maybe 10 or 20 minutes long, and I'll talk a little bit more about the limits of a flight and that sort of thing in a following slide. But just to give you a sense, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work, and then the actual missions collection are actually pretty quick. These are some example single images from that area, just to give you a sense of the resolution that we're getting and the ability to identify plants from the sky. So, you know, what I would say is if you can walk the site and you know basically what vegetation types are available, you could zoom into these types of images and draw lines around them. I don't know that if someone wasn't at the site, they'd be able to identify plants, so I don't want to oversell that capability, but you would not fly a drone there without standing on the ground, so why not walk through and do a vegetation survey? The image on the left was taken from a 27 to 35 meter altitude with our standard consumer grade drone setup with a GoPro. And then the one on the right was with the commercial grade setup. And you'll notice there's a little bit of blurring on this one on the right. I think that's partly because the wind was blowing, and so there's not too much we can do about that. You can also see the difference between the one on the left was in August and the one on the right in September, so you can start to see some yellowing in the willows. And zooming in a little more, I just wanted to show you the limitations of zooming in. We start to get a little bit of blurring from the breeze that was blowing that day. So zooming out now, these are showing all the same area. So it's the same area with the willow trees, but this is the complete ortho mosaic from our commercial grade drone that flew a larger area. So it can fly faster and higher for this kind of imagery and cover a larger area. And it shows us that the riparian area was very green at this time of year at the end of September, and the surrounding areas are brown. So this is in the true color in the upper right. So then because we have the 5 different bands here, we can do a color infrared image like I showed for some of the other imagery. And you can really see the active vegetation being in these reds and purples. And then in the upper right, we have the NDVI, which is the one that's bright white for active vegetation. So that gets saturated pretty quickly. So you can see how wide the green riparian area is, but you lose some of the detail in there. So then we can use another vegetation index with that red edge band that we have to see a little bit more of the structure. So what's in the understory, where are the shrubs versus trees, and that sort of information. So lots of potential here for monitoring over time using those vegetation indices. Here's another example just to give you a sense of a different type of site. In the site, there's a mowed grassy area and then trees of varying ages. We have some bigger, older trees and some smaller trees, and then the riparian area over here immediately on the stream bank. And so this, the three-dimensional surface, the true color image, and the three-dimensional model here with the overlay, those are all from the consumer grade drone setup. And then the one in the lower right is a color infrared image from our commercial grade drone setup. So something to notice is that this gray model here, it does a great job at figuring out the heights and the shapes of the different trees. However, the true color image and the color infrared, you see huge shadows. And so this is really showing the limit of our season for imaging with drones around here. This was October 2nd. Even if we fly near solar noon, which is always what we try to do to minimize shadowing, this time of year, there are going to be a lot of shadows. So we can still get some good information out of it, but we're starting to get to the limit of what we can do down here with the multispectral imagery. I put a rectangle here to show that the next slide will zoom in a little, just to give you a better sense of how fine the resolution is. This little scale bar is 2.5 meters. Sorry, that's hard to see. So we have here a three-dimensional surface. Again, it's the same one. So you can see a big old tree, and you can see what's growing right along the stream banks here. And then the same thing in the color infrared. So interestingly, our surface model can kind of see through those shadows, but when we look at these, the color on these images, it's a little hard to see what's going on in the shadow area. This is another example from an area with a canyon, so we really can pick up the topography as well, where there's not too much vegetative cover. Wanted to show that example. So quickly, some of the caveats and limitations of this drone work. There really are significant limitations and caveats. Flying a drone requires training, requires FAA certification as a remote pilot, and lots of practice. This is a time investment for sure, and one that will pay off if you have somebody designated who will be able to continue to serve in that role and train other people, but it definitely takes some time. Permission to fly is huge. We never fly over any area where we don't have permission. We don't fly over people and that sort of thing. In terms of safety, we're really beholden to the weather. If it's more than 10 to 15 mile an hour winds, I will not fly, just not to take the chance. If there's any kind of precipitation, if there are storms in the area, if it's cloudy, which blocks our view to satellites that we need to fly safely, anything like that, then we won't fly. If it's too hot, if it's too cold, you need to be aware of what the air currents are doing. So there's a lot of intricacies there. So I spend a lot of time watching weather apps in the flying season. Obstacles, that can be really significant. Not only do we need a safe place to take off and land, but we need to make sure that every bit of our mission is safe. We're going to clear all the obstacles, watch out for power lines, birds of prey, anything like that. And then we really need to think a lot about flight duration in terms of the batteries, because if the batteries run out while your drone is in the air, it will crash, and that's not what we want. So we need to think very carefully. You know, there are a lot of trade-offs, because if you, for example, fly higher up, then you can cover a larger area with less battery power, but then your ground resolution will be more coarse. And so if you fly lower, then you might be able to capture more fine details lower down, but you might have to do more missions to cover the same area, that sort of thing. So we're always thinking about battery power when we're planning our missions. Shadows, as I showed on the previous slide, can be an issue. So we always try to fly around solar noon. Of course, in the summertime when it's in the 90s and electronics don't really do well in the heat, that can be a difficult issue to deal with. What I refer to as a DEM, or a digital elevation model, those three-dimensional models, it's important to remember that those are the top surface. And so that's showing whatever is the top canopy layer. And so if you ever want to look at the shape of the stream channel underneath the vegetation, then you would need some additional information to be able to, for example, look underneath the reed canary grass and see what the shape of the channel is. Some of the hiccups we ran into were with software and device compatibility, as I sort of referred to briefly before. We're dealing with different software for planning and flying the mission, and then the drone will have these different sensors on it. We need to be able to communicate with the drone and the sensors successfully throughout the entire mission for everything to work right. The sensors need to be communicating with the drone and so on. So there's definitely some troubleshooting that happens with any new drone setup. And ideally, once you have a drone setup that you're using and a set of protocols, then that should be really minimized. This is something I wanted to share as my note to myself, to say that there are many other types of sensors that can be mounted on a drone. For one example, this is a thermal infrared image from the Medin Forest Ecosystem Dynamics Lab at WSU, where I'm doing some research now. And there's a lot of potential for looking at drought stress or fire-related issues with thermal infrared. And there are many other types of sensors that you can mount on a drone. But in a nutshell, we showed that we can use drone imagery in our part of the world to document greenness and vegetation structure at the times of interest for riparian areas around here, and identify different plant taxa within those areas. Some of the practical limitations, as I was just mentioning, include permission to fly, the safety, the expertise. access to all the different processing software and hardware, and simply the time and capacity for dealing with all that. But when we put it together with ground-based data and potentially satellite data, drone imagery can really help address some questions or maybe contribute to planning, story sharing, reporting, and adaptive management. So are we ready to use these tools for riparian monitoring? We started talking with some of the conservation district staff and Blues Conservation District and a couple of others about some of the challenges and opportunities here. And some of the things we came up with are generally, not to say lack of awareness as much as there's so much information out there. It's hard for even us to keep up, and we're doing this work right now. Historically, there's been a lot of controversy, concerns for privacy, and then variable capacity and interest. Of course, it takes a lot to get up and running with this sort of technology, and it may not be worthwhile in a lot of cases. And then just the practical constraints, such as those I went over a couple slides back. But in terms of opportunities, there are so many existing platforms and relationships for information sharing, like this symposium, like the work that we're doing at WSU, and collaborations, and also frameworks for review and evaluation, because, you know, we're here, we always want to make sure that the work that's done is robust and solid, and sometimes through reporting processes, there's another layer of review and evaluation. So just to wrap up here, because I think I'm about out of time, drones and free satellite imagery could really complement existing ground-based strategies. They all have advantages and limitations, and it's going to depend on the situation at your site. And it's really about knowledge sharing if we want to develop and implement robust workflows. So we'll be sharing our lessons learned on our website. Stay tuned for that. And I'm sorry if I went over the time, but thanks to everyone who supported this research, and my contact information is on this slide.
Great, thank you, Amanda. There was one question about the pool noodles, and if you could repeat what you use those for if they were for scale.
Oh, yes. So the pool noodles, we placed them throughout the image area, and then we surveyed them with a high-resolution GPS. Then when we put all of our images into the processing software, we could tell it exactly where all those points were, which enabled it to nail down the image that it made for us in the end. And that will enable us to compare that to future missions in the same place and measure differences from one date to the next.
Another question and comment we have is, some of my drone images come out in a fisheye look. Has that occurred for you, and any way to remediate that, or is that what it's designed for? Have you heard of that? Maybe I'm using the wrong software for flight mission / image capturing. Or maybe it's a post-processing.
Yeah. So when we were working with the GoPro, it did have a fisheye, and we cannot change that in the individual images, but in the software we use, we were able to tell it, these are fisheye photos, and then it was able to correct that when it stitched the images together.
Next question, are there legal requirements to maintain a visual of the commercial grade UAV while in flight?
Yes, and so that can be a real limitation if there are sites where you can't maintain visual line of sight. Sometimes you can avoid that by just breaking it into multiple missions and moving your location to launch and land so that you can always see the drone throughout. Of course, if there are places where there are big trees covering the area that was planted or something, and you're not going to be able to see through the trees. But as long as you can figure out a place where you can launch from where you have line of sight, then you're okay.
Do you have recommendations for the number and spacing of ground control points for drone mapping? And are these only needed for 3D mapping?
Yes, so the control points are only needed for the 3D mapping. If you just want to compare images visually over time, you don't have to bother with those control points because they are a bunch of extra work. But that's something that we did for the extent of areas that I showed in this presentation. We spaced 6 different control points throughout the area, and that was really sufficient to get pretty good accuracy. We're still working up the results from that, and we'll make them available when we have them. You know, people that are doing really high resolution studies, like trying to detect the amount of erosion and soil loss, and they need to measure at the centimeter scale, they might do many more control points per area, but we were trying to do something that we thought would be feasible for monitoring, so we could be on and off site in 4 hours or something by only doing 6 points or so and then doing the GPS survey.
What have you found the
question.
optimal flight altitude for drone monitoring of riparian areas? An optimal flight altitude?
That's a great question. We ended up trying to fly as low as we safely could because we felt like in this area where we're dealing with shrubs and grasses and forbs and trees, there weren't really a lot of published studies out there that were dealing with that variety, but it seemed like the best way to get the best information is to fly as low as you safely can. So it varied by site. You know, if we were just imaging mostly a bunch of ponderosa pines, we would fly higher to be safe. So that would be more like 30, 40 meters, maybe even 50 meters. And if it was the site that's mostly shrubs and grasses, we'd try to fly low, so more like 25 meters. And if we were building a three-dimensional model, we would actually fly missions at 2 different altitudes because it would create a better model. Anyone who's interested in the details of that, you know, like protocols and how to plan a mission, please follow up with me and I'd be happy to give more detailed information.
Great. A follow-up on the GPS control points. How are these points synced with the drone, and are they collected during the site walkthrough with a handheld GPS? What are some examples of the very accurate GPS devices?
Yes, so what we use is a TopCon control station, so it's an RTK GPS. And so it has a base station and a rover, and it networks with all the satellites to give you very high resolution, very accurate GPS. So we would walk around and do a site survey, and we would survey the location and elevation of all of our control points, and then also of different vegetation points, and measure vegetation height so that we'll be able to ground truth our model. We're still in the process of working up all those results. But we should have, you know, the accuracy should be on the order of 10 to 20 centimeters based on our preliminary results and other studies that we've read. I'm trying to think if I'm missing part of the answer to that question. Did I answer all the parts of that question?
What are some examples of very accurate GPS devices? I guess you said the RTK, but.
Yeah, so we use a TopCon, it's a TopCon control station, RTK GPS. There are other types of differential GPS units that people sometimes use. And then there are different requirements if you're just trying to build one three-dimensional model, or if you want to build one that can actually measure change over time. So there's a little bit of an extra step if you're out of internet access, which we always were. When then you need to resolve your GPS readings with the satellite network, and so you would need to make sure that your equipment is capable of doing that.